Hi, everybody. If we can make our way into the ballroom, we're going to get our panel started in about a minute. Win, would you mind getting people from the outside? Susanna from the other side? Thanks. Just as a reminder, please, everyone, mute your cell phones. We have a really, I think, important panel, also because I'm chairing it, but that's just the other side that we have going on. But I think this is a topic that you're all going to want to hear a little bit more about, which is Israel and the Gaza war. Where are we today? What are the strategic challenges that face us in the United States and Israel tomorrow? And we're going to touch on discussing the different theaters of this war is reverberating, both in Israel, in Gaza, in the West Bank. We've already touched on Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, so we're going to speak less about that. But also we'll cover what's going on in international organizations, international tribunals, and also we'll cover what's going on American college campuses and in the White House and on Capitol Hill. So we have a lot to cover in the next hour. We are joined by three individuals I consider to be both my Northern Star on these issues, but also individuals who are at the forefront of research, policy advocacy, and deep thought on this topic. We have Daniel Pipes, who we heard from earlier, but also the connection to this panel is his upcoming book on Israel Victory, coming out in June. We already spoke about that. We have Jonathan Schanzer, the Senior Vice President at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the author of a book on Hamas and the last war before this one, which is a must-read, and a former analyst at the U.S. Treasury Department, also a former employee of the Middle East Forum, and a friend of mine going back 20 years to when he was an intern at AIPAC, Boris Zilberman, who then went to become the Director of Defense Programs for AIPAC. He had a stint at FDD as well, and is now the Director for Policy and Strategy at the CUFI Action Fund. And myself, I'm just going to be the traffic controller. So without further ado, we'll start our panel. Are the mics working? Yeah, the mics are working. I want to start with Daniel Pipes. Daniel, the events of October 7th shocked many, including the US government, the Israeli government, and the Western world. How did Israel get there?
Well, let me first say that I'm not Alberto Fernandez.
Well, that's...
I think the Israeli security establishment has become less and less competent as its means have grown and grown. If you go way back to the beginning of the Zionist defense forces in the 1880s and 90s, go back to the Yishuv, go back to the first 20 years of Israel, you see an extraordinary ability to marshal the meager resources compared to the opposition, whether it be a group of Palestinians or a bunch of Arab states. The Israelis are extraordinary, and they won for themselves a reputation as geniuses. I mean, 3 armies in 6 days? Starting in 1973, the Israelis can't do anything right. Their means have, of course, grown and grown. Think of the wings of F-35 planes. But they made profound mistakes in 1973. But those were tactical mistakes. But the greater mistakes came later. I think it dates to 1992-93, with the collapse of the Soviet Union the victory over Iraq, the sense in the Israeli security establishment, well documented at the time, that Israel no longer faced an existential threat, that it became much more touchy-feely. Shimon Peres was the guiding spirit of the time, that true strength lies not in tanks, but in poetry. And then came the Oslo Accords, which was, an incredible, you bring in your worst enemy and make him your neighbor. And then came 2005 and the retreat from Gaza unilaterally, getting nothing in return, allowing the Hamas to take over a couple years later, allowing it to build this infrastructure. So it was a disastrous 5 decades that was hidden by the fact that the Israeli security establishment had this grand old reputation from the old days. And so I think that's how Israel got there. And you mentioned it surprised Israel and others, but I would argue it most of all surprised Hamas. Hamas never expected this. Inconceivable. And I would argue that Hamas got too much. It's like the dog that got the car. This 1,200 deaths was not and its expectation, and has many. They didn't expect an all-out war. They didn't expect what they got, and it's been very painful for them. So the ineptitude of the Israeli security establishment.
Jonathan, from October 8th onwards, we currently have observed Israel in a state of war in Gaza, but also Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Iran. What's the current state of play now, 7 months after the October 7th attacks? 8 months after.
Well, first of all, let me just say this. Wonderful to be here with everyone. As you already heard, I used to work for Middle East Forum, 24 years ago, something like that, which is odd because I'm only 35. But I want to thank Daniel, actually, for really teaching me the ropes as I got started in this business, and it's really served me well over the years, so I want to thank you. Look, the war is complicated, as wars often are. Israel is at war on multiple fronts. The Hamas challenge is just one of the challenges that Israel is dealing with. And there, I think there's actually some relatively good news. They're on the 5-yard line in terms of the hard fighting. Yes, there's still going to be pockets of resistance, and there will be insurgencies and the like for probably months, if not years to come. But the hard fighting in terms of dismantling the infrastructure of the Hamas military, they're down to Rafah, basically. But there it's going to get complicated very quickly because, first of all, thanks to U.S. pressure, the Israelis have not gone into Rafah for more than 2 months. That means that Hamas has had 2 months to prepare for this final battle. That means IEDs. It means additional traps and plots and plans that they've been hatching over the past 2 months. But then there's the other complexity here, which is what lies on the other side of Rafah. And that is, of course, Egypt. And if you've been watching what's been going on in the Egyptian press, what's been revealed here, the Egyptians are warning that they could downgrade ties with Israel, the longest lasting peace between Israel and an Arab neighbor. The Egyptians are actually warning of a full rupture with Israel. Now, the question is, why? Why would the Egyptians be so apoplectic right now? The simple explanation that we hear is that, well, they're afraid of having Palestinian spillover from Gaza into the Sinai Peninsula. But the more you scratch at the surface, the more you realize what's below the surface, and that is that we're very likely to find a highway of tunnels connecting Egypt to Gaza. This is probably the only explanation for how Hamas has fought 5 wars with Israel over the course of the last decade and a half, and somehow has been able to replenish its rockets time and again. How fighters have somehow been able to train in places like Iran and Turkey and then come back into Gaza. They had to leave some way, and it was not by way of the Mediterranean, where the Israelis have a full cordon of security around the Gaza Strip, and it's not through Israel itself. You may have heard just yesterday, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, came out and said that they were treating 1,000 wounded Hamas fighters in hospitals in Turkey. How did they get there, right? We keep, I think, coming back to this place where we have to understand that Egypt has played a double game. We were under the impression that Sisi was interested in destroying Hamas, and that was probably the case for maybe 5 years or so. Somewhere around 2018, 2019, we don't know exactly what happened, but it appears that he was susceptible to influence, whether by the Qataris or by the Muslim Brotherhood itself or by the Iranians or by Hamas. We don't know, but it appears that he decided to look the other way. And right now, I think that a lot of the messaging from the United States about not going into Rafah and the focus on the humanitarian, I think it's only part of the picture. I think that the this White House is deeply afraid of watching a full-blown rupture between Israel and Egypt, and they're trying to hold it together with duct tape right now, and I don't know if it's working. But I think that's something to watch as we move forward. But in the meantime, yeah, we've got additional fronts that are open. We've got the Houthis in Yemen firing occasional ballistic missiles at Israel. By the way, Israel's done a magnificent job of shooting down, I think, 99% of them so far. But it's unsustainable if this continues because each interception is roughly $1 million+. And that's just over the course of time, that's just not something that Israel can sustain, nor can Israel sustain the current pace that it is in shooting down the drones and rockets coming out of Lebanon, where we've only seen a fraction of what Hezbollah has been able to unleash. As we all know, there's something like 200,000 rockets in the Hezbollah arsenal, as well as precision-guided munitions and other dangerous weapons that can be deployed against Israel. So what we're looking at right now is the Iranian ring of fire strategy, where it has encircled Israel with multiple proxies, and they're firing. But and I suppose the good news is that Israel has actually been able to fend off most of that and to keep things to kind of a manageable level. But there is that question that we all have to ask ourselves. At what point does Iran escalate? At what point does Iran order its proxies to begin to saturate Israel with more and more of these weapons that they have amassed? And this is, I think, the thing that we're all waiting for. This is the question that we're all trying to answer, is why has Iran not unleashed everything all at once? I think we're lucky that it has not up until now, but I think Israel is now faced with a difficult choice, which is at what point does it begin to go on a counteroffensive? I think we can see what Iran is trying to do. I think what's less clear to me is what Israel's doing in response to bring an end to this and to make Iran feel the pressure, to make Iran feel the pain. They are at the center of all of this, and they have yet to pay a serious price.
Israel's capabilities to deal with Iran and other client states and proxy groups of Iran in the past has largely been predicated on what the United States is willing to let Israel to do. Boris, how has this issue become at the forefront of the foreign policy discussion of the 2024 presidential election? And what's the wider discussion and implications as it relates to Gaza and Israel today in Washington, D.C.?
Thanks, Greg, and thanks for having me here. Good to be here with you all. It's, if the Middle East is complicated, Congress is also very complicated today. You see it in both on the Republican side and the Democratic side, where you have infighting. On the Democratic side, you have progressives and the more traditional pragmatist Democrats fighting it out very specifically over Israel. And on the Republican side, you have this kind of Freedom Caucus more strain of isolationism that's creeping in, where they may not be fighting it out over Israel per se, because they'll all say they support Israel, but not all of them are walking the walk. A lot of them talk the talk, but don't walk the walk. And so you saw that play out in the emergency supplemental for the $14.3 billion to resupply Iron Dome, David Sling, armaments, and also act Israel for successive administrations, for Congress rather. Congress has been the defense line for Israel, whether going back to Reagan to now, et cetera. They've always been there when administrations have had issues with different Israeli governments. to deliver what the Israelis needed. And that's because it's a reflection of the people of the United States that still overwhelmingly support Israel. And I think that's obviously going to play into 2024. I think the administration has been wrong in how they perceive how much favor they need to curry with certain groups in Michigan and other places. You can look at the John Fettermans of Pennsylvania who have bucked the kind of traditional consensus that's kind of happened in the Democratic Party that they need these certain votes to win. And you see the polling that Fetterman's doing quite well there. And on the flip side, you see kind of, again, isolationist Republicans who are not necessarily focusing on Israel, but that are trying to pull the U.S. back from supporting allies in this type of robust way that Israel needs. You saw this with the supplemental. And I think kind of jumping off what Jonathan said of what's coming over the horizon, you have the 10-year MOU that runs out fiscal year 28, it's the last year. So by 2027, you need to get a new 10-year or however long MOU in place with Israel. I think there's going to be a lot of lessons learned here as far as are there things that the Israelis need to onshore? Certain precision munitions that are now part of a thing that when you are on the Hill tomorrow, it's likely going to be a vote tomorrow in the House to try to break this kind of blockade, this embargo that the administration has put in place on certain bombs, JDAMs, et cetera, for the Israelis. And so they have an important role to play in that. And this MOU that's going to run out, these lessons learned of what they need for these fights, whether it's to control Hamas and Gaza, to fight back against Hezbollah in Lebanon, because having 100,000 displaced Israelis is not sustainable in the north, obviously. And then dealing with Iran and the nuclear program. And for that, the Israeli defense planners need a large window of kind of predictable funding, the $3.8 billion they get currently, whatever the next MOU might look like. And the next president, whoever it is going to have obviously a huge role to play. Obama and Netanyahu were able to come together on an MOU. I think the next administration will be able to come together on an MOU as well, but it's really going to be Congress that I think that's going to have to be pushing them to come up with something that works and can be sustainable, so you don't get into these kind of ugly fights that we just saw in the supplemental over these weapons currently. So you need that sort of predictable funding cycle to be able to plan how do you take on Hezbollah, how do you take on the Iranian nuclear program. And so I think that's kind of over horizon congressionally and bilaterally the biggest thing that's coming up.
And a lot of the debates that have been going on in Washington also are reflected in Jerusalem, where I think we're at a point right now where Prime Minister Netanyahu offers his opinion that Israel's strategy must be total victory over Hamas. But there's a question in Washington and even in Jerusalem, what does that mean? Daniel, you have written about this idea of the failed conceptia, or conception of Israeli strategy as it relates to its enemies. Where are we right now with the Israeli government's decision-making as it relates to a firm policy of what to do in Gaza now and the day after?
The best I can tell is complete confusion. Domestic pressures from the United States and elsewhere have led to a near paralysis, which we can see in the slowness of the decision-making. The conceptia, this is a term that came up after the 1973 war, when the commission, the Agranat Commission that did an inquiry into what went wrong, how come Israel was so surprised. And it came down to this notion that the Syrian and Egyptian forces will not attack Israel until they get a new Soviet fighter aircraft. And until that happened, Israel was okay. Well, the Syrians and Egyptians attacked before they got that. And the conceptia this time, using that old term, was that Hamas would soften, would be more inclined to economic growth and good governance, so long as there was time for it to grow and mature and become less ideological. And this was the key notion behind what led to October 7th, I see that conception is still there. You are hearing voices within Israel, opinions that are well respected, government officials, going back to this idea that the Hamas will be softened, will be less of a threat, if only there is a lot of money put into Gaza. So I see a period of flux, and Netanyahu has repeatedly talked about victory, total victory, absolute victory, and the like, but I don't see that it has any real material substance to it.
So, Jonathan, if we're on the 5-yard line, if the remaining 6 battalions, Deir al-Bach, Nasiriyah, and 4 in Rafah, are the last military challenge for the IDF to complete the destruction of Hamas's military infrastructure, what's the next play after we score a touchdown?
Yeah, we're still in the, I think, the middle of the first quarter, if we're going to take this all the way here. This war is not against Hamas. And I think everybody needs to understand this, that Hamas is one proxy, and actually not even the powerful one, in the matrix of the so-called axis of resistance, which, by the way, I take issue with that term because it really does feel like it's the Israelis who are resisting the overall Iranian advances across the region, but never mind that term. Israel's going to need to go north, and it's going to need to battle Hezbollah, because those 100,000 Israelis have been forced out of their homes in the northern communities, and Israel's not going to end the war before they are returned to their homes. And I mean, I can tell you that the Israelis actually wanted to start this war in the north. They did not want to start in Gaza. The Biden administration steered them away from the north because it was going to be a more difficult battle. It was going to be one that would be more brutal and that would require more assistance from the US. And the way that I heard it from someone who was in the room was that Biden said, don't start wars that you can't finish without us. So they said, go south. And so the Israelis went south, and they're on the 5-yard line, and they're being told not to finish that war either. At some point, they're going to do it. And I think right now we can see that there is an incremental approach to what's happening in Rafah, that they've now moved into eastern Rafah and along the Philadelphia corridor, and then they're going to, I think, slowly move their way further and further to where the center of the action is. But when that's done, they're going to have to go north. And by the way, when they go north, that battle will be brutal. That battle will likely lead to Israeli skyscrapers being toppled. You will see tens of thousands of dead on the Israeli side if this war comes to pass, unless Israel does something that we just were not ready for, that we couldn't see coming. But if this turns into a 12-round heavyweight bout, there will be a lot of damage in Israel as a result. But it won't even end there, because don't forget, there's about 12 Shia militias in Iraq and Syria that need to be dealt with. The Houthis in Yemen need to be dealt with. And then don't forget, you've got the Islamic Republic itself, which just recently fired 300 missiles and drones at Israel, and they've got a lot more where that came from. And they may yet still make a dash for a nuclear weapon. So we are in the middle of, I think, really the first round of a long battle that may be ahead. And getting back to, I think, Daniel's conception here, Israel needs to be able to articulate what its strategy is for victory, and not just for Hamas. That's small fries, or as they say in Hebrew, kesef katan. What we need is, I think, a much bigger picture of how Israel is going to come away from this stronger and intact.
Daniel?
And to continue with my indictment of the Israeli security establishment, there is no more dramatic point than these 150, 200,000 missiles and rockets in southern Lebanon. The Israelis allowed the great bulk of them to come from Iran through Syria to Lebanon. It is inexplicable. It has taken place over 15, 20 years. And I have repeatedly asked, how did this happen? Why are you doing this? I mean, there was, remember the Mavi Marmara was over a little bit of cement? I mean, nothing, triviality. And yet, in contrast to this great drama over some cement, nothing that we know of anyway has stopped these tens and tens of thousands of missiles and rockets. Unbelievable.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I'll just add, I completely agree. There was an effort underway by the Israelis over the last 8 to 10 years. They called it the campaign between the wars, or Mabam, is the Ma'aracha Ben HaMilchamot in Hebrew. This idea that they could strike these weapons shipments one at a time, one-off strikes in Syria and in other places. But they didn't get all of them. And the idea of fighting a war in between wars in order to prolong the next war, the start of the next war, was, I think, incredibly faulty judgment on the part of the IDF. If they knew that this was a problem and they were still watching it grow incrementally, it was only going to get worse over time. And it did. And so there was a major mistake. It's funny, I was in the middle of writing a book about the Mabam as something that the Israelis had touted as a success, but was still highly controversial within the Israeli military establishment because people were still seeing the growth of the Iranian proxy armies and that eventually it was going to get a lot uglier. Well, that book, thankfully, was preempted, or maybe not so thankfully, was preempted by 10/7, and now I'm writing the book about the failure of this paradigm, how this was not ever going to be something that was sustainable for the military. And getting back to Daniel's description of the IDF in its early decades, this was a much more daring military. They understood that they needed to take risks in order to keep their enemies at bay. What the Israelis were doing over the last 8 to 10 years was just treading water, getting along to go along with the United States. And there I have to just say that I think the influence of the US military on the IDF has been a net negative. And I will say freely that the tech that the Israelis get from the US is terrific. The assistance in developing out systems like Iron Dome, obviously irreplaceable. But the culture that we have here of being too strong to fight Iran, accusing Iran when they deliberately attack our soldiers, where they call Iran unprofessional, and that is their rebuke, that has permeated into Israel. It has gotten to the point where they are willing to hold back because the US tells them that they can or that they should. This is a decision point right now for Bibi and for the IDF, really for the entire country. They need to win. They need to start tactically and win in Gaza, but then they need to think about the bigger picture. It's not going to be easy, but it needs to be done.
Boris?
Just to add to that, an indictment on Lebanon is its U.S. policy. U.S. policy has been an abysmal failure in propping up the Lebanese armed forces with billions of dollars, who have acted basically as an auxiliary force to Hezbollah, acted as a human shield of sorts that limits Israel's area of operations. And that's part of the indictment there too, is that U.S. policy has been a crazy failure and completely unrecognized by either party. And this has been a, if you want to talk uniparty, this has been a uniparty position amongst Democrats and Republicans who are close to the Department of Defense to prop up this group because the U.S. wants to kick the can down the road in Lebanon, and that, Israel's in that can then too. Because we're not willing to deal with the hard questions in Lebanon that our policy has failed, and we are in essence also propping up Hezbollah.
Besides the Houthi, Hezbollah, Syrian, Iraqi, West Bank, and Gaza fronts, there's also a non-kinetic front, which is taking place in international organizations across the entire UN system and the system of so-called international justice. You now have South Africa bringing an indictment of genocide or accusations of genocide against Israel. Egypt just joined in these, along with Turkey. When I ask Boris, what do you think's next for Israel's international legal troubles?
That's a good question. Look, it helps. These are one of the things in Congress that once you zoom out a little bit outside of the war in Gaza, that there is more bipartisanship pushing back on the international investigations and so on, where you see a lot more Democrats coming on board. The administration is doing better there than on the Gaza front. And so I think on the international front, it's less divisive, I would say, amongst Democrats and Republicans.
There's a question about funding. One of the conversations Daniel and I have had for the past 10 years is that the propensity of Congress is to defund a program or an international organization that it disagrees with, but there's never a change on policy. Correct. If we deal with UNRWA, it's about the definition of what a Palestine refugee is. But the congressional solution to UNRWA's indiscretion or ignorance or downright cooperation with Hamas after October 7th was to defund it for a year. What policy changes can Congress make to deal with the International Criminal Court, to deal with the ICJ, to deal with the United Nations, not just those that are connected to money?
Look, I think to follow the law and defund any UN body that is recognizing the Palestinians, making moves, and certainly engaged in these type of activities is, money talks, and that's the way that, Congress is able to, with purse strings, in absence of an administration that's willing to actually put real pressure on them, that is one of their only tools. And so then it needs to be a lot more aggressive and take what's been done to UNRWA, extended it, indefinitely, but also on any of these bodies where the Palestinians are making moves to be recognized as a state, to defund them.
And I also think that there's a secondary implication here. Whereas the United States has signed the Rome Statute, which has basically given legitimacy to the International Criminal Court, it has not ratified it, meaning that the U.S. does not partake in these international tribunals. But more than that, its key U.S. allies like Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom, who are the main funders of the ICC. And pressure should be brought to bear on close American allies that have gone along with this indefensible prosecution of the Jewish state in The Hague. But beyond international organizations, we also see this very close to home. There are pro-Hamas organizations, whether it be at the national level that are coordinating activities on college campuses, whether it be on the college campus itself. We heard about this in the first panel with Sam and Dexter and Ryan about the activities that are going on there. But what is the effect of this war for students, maybe specifically Jewish American and Israeli students, or more broadly, pro-Israel students? Who's organizing it, and what can be done about it? And I'm going to refer to Jonathan first on this, because if you guys are on social media, if you go to X, formerly Twitter, the thread to read on this subject is on, I think you've pinned it on top of your profile, but let's maybe get a little bit into it.
Sure. Well, the long and short of it is that there is one organization that I track above all the others, because it is the group that incubated and created Students for Justice in Palestine, and not enough people know of the existence of this organization. It's called American Muslims for Palestine, or AMP. AMP was created in 2006, but the roots of it go back actually to 1988, when the Holy Land Foundation was created. Daniel knows quite a bit about that one. Holy Land was shut down in 2001 by the FBI and the Treasury for sending $12 million to Hamas, and 5 of its senior leaders went to jail. But the following year, a new organization was created. That was called Kind Hearts. Kind Hearts was the same people at a lower level doing the same things that Holy Land had been doing down in Texas, and that was shut down. And I actually worked on that case when I was at the Treasury Department in 2006. And then there was one other one. It's called the IAP, the Islamic Association for Palestine. They were the public relations and fundraising firm that was doing work for the Holy Land Foundation, and they were sued by the family of a young man who was killed by Hamas. They were awarded $156 million. Never paid. 9 different people that worked for those 3 Hamas charities that I just mentioned went on to work for AMP. AMP was founded by a guy named Hatem Bazian, who created the first SJP chapter in Berkeley in the 1990s. He then went on to create something called SJP National, and today there are 220 SJP chapters across the United States, funded and organized by this same group, by American Muslims for Palestine. Now people say, well, that doesn't prove anything. That's history. What about now? Well, interestingly, we've seen Hatem Bazian on the campus of Penn, San Diego State University, and Berkeley. And we've seen Osama Abu Ershad, the executive director of AMP. He's been at Columbia. He's been at GW. They are blanketing the campuses where we are seeing the chaos unfold. This organization, with its roots in Hamas, with its connections to Samuel Arian and a whole bunch of other characters that we've been tracking for many years involved in illicit finance and terrorism in the Palestinian authorities. This is the key to understanding what's going on right now. If you keep pointing the finger at SJP, you're missing the point. These are the useful idiots of the AMP. AMP needs to be the focus of our attention right now.
And there's also been some court cases which have been brought against NSJP and against AMP, the Boehm case. But two others which were just filed, I believe, a week and a half ago, one by the firm Greenberg Traurig and another by Sharat Adin. The avenue that they've pursued in court in the rocket docket of the East District of Virginia has been to have Israeli victims of the October 7th attacks act as plaintiffs and accuse these groups of material support for terrorism. Can you comment on those cases and what might be the financial remedies or the other policy remedies that might come out of it?
Is that for me?
Yeah.
Look, I've seen the Greenberg one, and it seems to draw pretty heavily from the work that we've done on AMP, testimony that I gave before Congress twice in 2016, then again in November of last year, where we've documented to the extent that we can all that can be derived from open source. The Sharat Adin one, I don't know. It seems like it's a similar one, but perhaps not as robust. The Boehm case is the big one, though. This is the family of that young man who was killed in the 1990s in a Hamas shooting. The family basically said, IAP, you owe us money, and then they shut their doors. And then they see AMP sprout up with the same people doing the same things years later, and they say, wait a minute, you're the alter ego of IAP. You're the alter ego of this Hamas charity that owes us money for funding Hamas. And that has actually just gone through discovery in a court case in Illinois. And that court case will be heard in the next several months in Illinois. If the judge rules in favor of the Boehm family, then it will have immense ramifications for these other cases. It pretty much assures the other cases are going to be victories for the plaintiffs. But more importantly, it will raise questions about whether AMP has a right to exist any longer. I should just note one more thing. In Virginia right now, the Attorney General has opened up an investigation into AMP. The state has, where they are looking into potential irregularities in the disclosures of this organization, which is based in Falls Church, 20 minutes from here. That is going to be heard at the state legislature. A hearing on that will be happening soon. It's possible that AMP could be closed down well before that case in Illinois is ever heard. So this is an organization that is finally enduring a lot of challenges as a result to their roots in Hamas finance from years past. And it will be very interesting to see how it all plays out.
And Boris, you had some thoughts on campus too that I thought you wanted to share.
No, and Jonathan covered it fantastically. There are other AGs around this country that are also looking at this issue. I'm guessing Virginia's not going to be the last.
Thank you.
I know we've been talking a long time. We haven't had time for yep, Marilyn, thank you. Time for Q&A, unless anybody has any, well, we can get into it in the Q&A. Who has the mic? Matt, do we have another mic over here? Here, Suzanne, let's go to the other side. Matt, we had a question over here in the middle. Yeah.
How does Saudi Arabian Crown Prince Salman, how does he signify in this situation?
I'm going to ask Jonathan to answer that.
You know, it's a good question, and I think it's been the one that the Biden administration has wanted to ask over and over again. Sort of, they want to bring the Saudis into this and potentially have them, take some kind of responsibility for the day after in Gaza. But I have to say there was a win and a victory, a win and a loss, a major victory and a major loss within the span of a few weeks as it related to Saudi Arabia. The victory was the evening of April 13th into the morning of the 14th when Iran fired those 300 missiles and drones at Israel, and the US-led architecture went into action and helped to shoot down a large number of those projectiles coming in from Iran. And there was that moment, and it wasn't just Saudi Arabia, it was the entire Arab world was looking around and saying, okay, I want to be in that club, right? That if the US is going to be able to do this and to defend the skies over Israel and to get the Jordanians, and by the way, the Saudis did take part in shooting down 2 of those missiles, as I understand it as well. Yeah. So that was the win. And then now we just snatched victory from, or defeat from the jaws of victory by right in the middle of Israel waging this 5-front war. The US government says we're going to withhold weapons to you. Now, if you're Saudi Arabia and you're considering a long-term relationship with the United States in defense and coordination, and you see that the United States is an incredibly reliable ally for 3 out of every 4 years, but on the 4th year, when you're in the middle of an election cycle and you're pandering to Michigan voters, and you realize that you cannot rely on the United States during that whole year, do you really want to be part of that club? And I think right now the Saudis are spooked. I think that they now see this administration as being wholly unreliable. And so I believe that any hope that the Biden administration have of cementing the next phase of the Abraham Accords, I think they likely destroyed it themselves, at least for a time.
Over here, Talia.
In 1948, there were 250,000 Palestinians in Gaza. Today, there are 2.2 million, so much for genocide. And in 6 years, there are going to be 3 million, and 6 years after, 4 million people in the same spot of the Gaza Strip. How is it going to get any better with such a congestion of population that's been indoctrinated, and we know the rest of it?
Daniel has a forthcoming piece on Palestinian demographics, kind of. And you've been following this subject for quite a while. Do you care to comment?
Well, Hong Kong and Singapore are successful, wealthy, law-abiding countries. Hong Kong used to be. Congestion, lack of natural resources, these are not, in the modern world, very important factors if you have education, rule of law, democracy, and so forth. So Gaza could flourish, but that means taking out Hamas or the PA, having a decent Gaza. I believe it's possible. I've come up with this term, decent Gaza. I would like to see the Israelis run an administration that is similar to what administration in Gaza, that is similar to what one sees in Egypt and Jordan, which is to say a tough police state where you don't mess with politics, you go about your business, and the state leaves you alone when you stay away from politics. I think that's possible. I think there are lots and lots of Gazans. Polling shows it, anecdotal evidence shows it, that there are lots of Gazans who are sick of Hamas and who want a normal life. Let me note that Hamas is, to my knowledge as a historian, unique in history. There are many, many regimes that exploit the civilian population as cannon fodder, using it. I mean, look at Putin. That's normal. But what Hamas has done has purposefully subjected its civilian population to bombing, hungers, misery, death. The more death, the more misery, the better Hamas stands in the outside world. We've seen that in the last half year. And the Gazan population is aware of this and hates it and wants something different. So I'm hoping that the Israelis push away the Saudis, push away the Jordanians, push away the PA, and implement their own decent Gaza with Gazans who are ready to work with Israel.
Stop.
Okay. So talking about the pro-Hamas organization that they support Hamas, I mean, as a humanitarian issue, I know many organizations here in the United States. They are Syrian Muslim Brotherhood organizations. They are supporting even Hamas and Gaza. At the same time, they are supporting the Syrian in the northwest only, on the area under the control of this radical Muslim group. So how can we stop funding this organization? You know, this is very, very, I mean, important, because they are now sharing in changing the demography of Afrin, and they are building their only houses for these people and changing the demography for.
So how do we stop the same groups
Yes.
that are supporting Hamas, but also supporting the ethnic cleansing of northern Syria from the Turks and others? Any comment?
Thank you.
I have one, without being an expert on what's happening in northwest Syria, I can just tell you that if there are crimes that are being committed, if there are groups that are engaging in terrorism, they need to be identified, they need to be sanctioned by the US government, and that becomes the predicate for any action that we take against them here in the US. So it's not very difficult to do. The problem is actually getting Washington to care about what's happening in northwest Syria. We have completely pivoted away from that war. It's as if it doesn't even exist, even as we continue to see the influence of the Turks and the Qataris and other Islamist supporters in that part of the world. And so, perhaps a campaign of sorts is necessary to shine a light on these groups and their funders and their local supporters here in the US.
Jonathan, I was almost able to get through an entire panel without mentioning Qatar. It's been good.
Always happy to talk about that, always.
Greg, apropos your RICO lawsuit, have you considered contacting Alan Dershowitz? He recently said on Fox News that he would provide pro bono legal services for suing these groups.
If Mr. Dershowitz was interested in participating in such an action, I would invite him to take part in it. He's aware of it, but we have not been approached by him yet, and I'd be open to that conversation. So, Brian?
So if the comment were that Israel should not start any wars that it couldn't win by itself, what wars can it win by itself, and will that be enough for victory?
I'll take a stab at this. I think Hamas is a very winnable war. I think it requires Israel to be determined to win and to move forward with or without American support. And that may be ultimately what Israel needs to do. And you get a sense already, as I mentioned, that Israel is fighting incrementally right now in Rafah with perhaps that ultimate goal in mind. And if Bibi is sticking to his guns, you may see the defeat of Hamas, at least at a strategic level. Tactically, you're going to still have problems in Gaza for some time, and I would expect that to be the state of play in Gaza until all the smuggling of weapons through Egypt is dealt with, as well as the remnants of Hamas. I'll just say this, that individually, each one of these proxies is very defeatable. The Houthis, defeatable. The Shiite militias in Iraq, defeatable. Even Hezbollah. Israel has some tough choices to make there, but this is an organization that can be destroyed. The question is whether Israel can fight them one at a time or whether it will be forced to deal with them as a group. When you deal with them as a group, the volume becomes more challenging, the number of weapons coming into your airspace. The Israelis need to have their heads on a swivel right now, and that's with low-intensity warfare happening around them. So there are some choices that need to be made. But I think ultimately, look, the way I've always looked at this since the war began is you can look at the Middle East like a chessboard, and the Iranians have put different pieces out into the middle of the board. Right? Each one of them, you can say Hamas is a knight and the Hezbollah is a bishop and, the Shiite militias are pawns. You can win a game of chess in two different ways, broadly speaking. One is to dominate the middle of the board and to pick off those pieces one at a time. Or you make a lightning strike for the king. And I think that the latter is really what's necessary here if you don't want to see Israel go through years and years of battling smaller actors that are not really the threat. The Islamic Republic of Iran is the threat that needs to be dealt with. The Israelis have been saying it for years. They've been talking about the head of the snake, the head of the octopus, whatever. They're not actually targeting the Islamic Republic. That is what needs to be done yesterday.
And just to follow up on that, the ultimate policy decision that has to be made by an Israeli government is not just about taking on Iran, and I agree with Jonathan on this, but what will the composition of the Israeli government that does that look like? Because currently, under this war cabinet, it looks united, but indecision is their strategy. And until they have the mettle to be able to take on a goal like that, and the population of Israel is able to fortify itself and exhibit a point of national resilience that it's ready to engage in a preemptive strategy, not a preemptive action, but a preemptive strategy of trying to fell the mullahs in Tehran, I don't think they're going to be able to make such a decision like that. The Israelis lack strategy. And until they have a coherent one, there will be more of the same. Boris?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, they're getting bogged down in the international politics, not in the tactical on the ground. And so that they have to make a decision not to get bogged down in those things and move forward with whatever their end goal is.
We have time for one last question from Lori Regan.
Thank you all for this terrific panel. It was really great. I guess this is probably for Jonathan. The one front that we don't hear too much about is Judea and Samaria, and we know that Iran's been shipping weapons through Syria into Jordan, into the West Bank. So is Israel asleep at the wheel with that? I mean, the difference with Gaza is that there was no IDF soldiers on the ground in Gaza. We do have IDF soldiers in Judea and Samaria. So can you give some insight on whether that's going to blow up at some point?
Yeah, it's a great question, Lori. Look, a couple things. One is, don't take your eye off of Jordan itself when we talk about this strategy of potentially trying to undermine or escalate within the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria. The Jordanians, on a recent trip that I took there, were quite candid about the way in which Iran has been trying to flood Jordan with Captagon, which is a drug that's being made in Syria, as addictive, they say, as fentanyl or some of the other things that are coming across into this country. There was a deliberate decision made by the Iranian regime it used to be that Jordan was a way station for the delivery of Captagon to the Gulf, where they could get $20 a pill. They're selling it for $5 in Jordan, with the idea that if they can flood Jordan, they can begin to undermine society there as well, while shipping in weapons, some of which stay in Jordan, and sometimes they move on to Judea and Samaria. In Judea and Samaria, it's another story entirely. They have been trying to flood the West Bank with weapons. You've probably seen, in the lead up to this war, the Israelis were operating in Jenin, and they had a tough battle there. Since then, every night, and I see it on Palestinian social media every night, the IDF is in Jenin, it's in Tulkarm, it's in Ramallah, it's in Jericho. They're everywhere, every night. By the way, that's where most of the reservists are actually operating right now. It's been there with the idea of trying to find the weapons, trying to find the fighters, the explosives. They're finding a massive amount. This is part of the next phase. I mentioned the Ring of Fire strategy, where you have all these different proxies that have been building up their rocket arsenals and attacking Israel. And we always talk about Lebanon, Gaza, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. The next probably two places that we're going to see erupt, West Bank, Jordan, maybe Egypt. They want to complete the circle. That is the strategy. I think the Israelis are handling it pretty well there so far, but there's a lot that we don't see. And so a lot also remains to be seen.
Daniel Pipes, Jonathan Schanzer, Boris Silberman, thank you.
Thank you.